So, welcome everybody to our APS DBIO event for September about communicating biological physics. Just before we get started, I wanted to share with you and with our audience who is viewing this later about our series. So let me just quickly share my screen. If you Google APS DBIO networking, you'll see this page. And it lists a variety of different events that we have hosted and are hosting going forward. So we're really happy to see you here today and encourage you to sign up for future workshops. The two that are scheduled already with Zoom links are about incorporating biological physics throughout your undergraduate curriculum, and a panel on the future of biological physics, sort of building off of the decadal survey report. So whither our field and what can we do to prepare the next generation of scientists to lead, and how do we change our curriculum and our teaching and our research and everything else. And then future events are a postdoc targeted event in the works, as well as a workshop on mental health and international mobility. So just wanted to give a shout out to those events. Meanwhile, today's session, delighted to have three people whose work I really admire, who are able to join us and share some strategies about communicating biological physics, our research, and the wonders of the field, and so on, to a broader audience. And so joining us today, we have Janet Iwasa from the University of Utah, Raghu Parthasarathi from the University of Oregon, and Philip Ball from the UK. What I'd like to start with is just asking each of them to briefly introduce themselves and maybe tell us a little bit about how they came to be interested in and then prolific at communicating science to others, and also give them a chance to kind of self-promote their research and or communications work that we might be interested in. So I'll just go in the order I see you on my screen. So Janet, why don't you start?
Sure. So my name is Janet Iwasa, and I am an assistant professor of biochemistry at the University of Utah. So my area of specialization is molecular animation. And, you know, the way I got into this was actually in graduate school. So I was trained as a cell biologist. And while I was in graduate school, I think I just realized that the way that most biologists represent, you know, their model figure is using very simplistic circles and squares and arrows. And that, you know, that they use these figures to communicate processes that are often dynamic and three-dimensional and crowded and happening in the context of cells. And I think, you know, one of the things that I thought about was that, you know, we're really oversimplifying our data and not doing very good justice to the science by representing the biology in such a simplistic way. And so in grad school, I got interested in animation partially because there were some other animations cropping up around that time as well. And I realized that this is something that I wanted to try doing. And so in grad school, I started taking some animation courses. I got super into it. And so kind of alongside finishing my PhD work, I was also doing animations and really specializing in molecular animations. And then for my postdoc fellowship, I basically tried to figure out a way to do animation full time while still staying in academia, which was a bit of a trick. But I managed to get a postdoctoral fellowship from the NSF and to basically animate the origins of life. This was a postdoctoral fellowship with Jack Shostak, and it was co-sponsored by the Museum of Science in Boston. And so for that project, I created a bunch of animations showing how the earliest cells were thought to have formed. And these animations were both used by Jack for research presentations, as well as presented at the Museum of Science within the context of an exhibit that I basically designed. And so So from there, I've had two faculty positions, and the first one was at Harvard Medical School, and now at the University of Utah, and I have my own group now as well. And basically, we really are focused on creating molecular animations. A lot of these are primarily used within the research community to communicate hypotheses and the ideas of how processes work at the molecular level to other scientists. But a number of them have also been used to communicate to the public in the context of, kind of public media. Some of them have been featured on television, newspapers, as well as in museums. Yeah, so that's a synopsis.
Great, thank you. Raghu, you're next on my screen. Would you like to go next?
Cool, thanks. And yeah, thanks for putting all this together. So yeah, I'm Raghu Parthasarathi. I'm a professor of physics at the University of Oregon. And in terms of research, what my group does is primarily explore microbial communities, especially those of the gut microbiome, which we investigate by looking into the guts of live zebrafish and looking at the physical structure and dynamics that are going on there. But of relevance to this panel, I have a longstanding interest in science communication, especially communicating science and biophysics in particular to non-scientists. And this includes like non-science major undergraduates or the general public or various audiences of outreach kinds of things. So several years ago, I, for example, created a Biophysics for non-science majors course here at the University of Oregon. I also write a blog. I should put the link in chat again. New people around that focuses in part on biophysics and more broadly on other issues of like science and higher education. And then recently, earlier this year, a pop science book I wrote about biophysics came out. It's called So Simple a Beginning. And my goal with it was to convey to the general reader the ways in which physical laws and themes really make life work and are manifested at scales ranging from like molecules to organisms. And as to how I got into all this, that's, I actually admit I was kind of unprepared for that question. It's a challenging one because I think like many things in my life, how I got into it was a meandering path. But I've always been interested in kind of communication and science communication in general. And especially actually after starting as faculty here at the University of Oregon, which is a large public university, I became especially interested actually in kind of general science literacy. So not what science majors are learning, but what the general student who's not a science major, but who's going to become part of a technologically advanced society and all those things. What do they learn and what understanding do they have of not only what science is, but what scientific thinking is? So I got involved in various activities to essentially like redesign a lot of our general education science courses and really bring kind of modern pedagogy into them, but also kind of modern topics. So not just kind of the old school physics for poets where it's the same block sliding down a ramp, but without the differential equations, but things that really kind of speak to the modern world. So this thread of being interested in science literacy and my professional, so to speak, or my scientific interest in biophysics kind of merged together, not only because I wanted to convey to people kind of the beauty and importance of biophysics, but also I felt and continue to feel that biophysics is actually a very good tool for communicating science literacy, both because of its relevance to kind of the everyday world and because it really illustrates kind of things like, what does it mean to have a model? How does one, what is science and what does it mean to model something or predict a phenomena and so on. So this merger of kind of science literacy and biophysics was actually quite a natural one. And it led, sort of one thing after another to this course, various outreach things, the blog. And then I really felt, and this maybe will come up in other questions and so on, the landscape of like, what does the general public think physics is a very, it's one that isn't very representative of what physics really is. And one of the big gaps, I think, is that biophysics, along with several other fields, is really underrepresented in the public consciousness of physics. And I thought, maybe a pop science book about biophysics will help this. And I spent a lot of time, thinking about what that might look like. And yeah, that led to the recent book.
Great. Thank you, Raghu. Phil.
Thank you. Well, my PhD many years ago was in physics. It was in condensed matter physics. And Raghu, I identify very much with what you've just said about the public perception of physics, because it's always seemed to me that, you know, that whole area of condensed matter is just absent entirely from the public consciousness of what physics is about. You know, all they see is accelerators and cosmology and so forth. And, you know, looking back, these days, I tell myself, if I had stayed in research in condensed matter physics, I would absolutely be researching the condensed matter physics of the cell, because I think that's such an explosive area at the moment and such an interesting one. But I didn't stay. I went from there to being an editor at Nature. And so I handled physical sciences at Nature for many years. And this meant sort of handling papers across the board in chemistry and material science and in physics. And I ended up handling, I think, probably most of the papers that Nature was receiving in that sort of interface of physics and biology in biophysics, because the biologists didn't really seem to quite get, on the whole, what what this field was, how physics had any relevance to biology. So I guess that was my sort of introduction to the biological sciences, to the life sciences, and it's become an increasing area of interest to me. At Nature, I was I was refereeing papers and deciding what Nature published, but there were also opportunities for writing, and I realized that actually this is what I had really, wanted to do. I'd always enjoyed writing. I'd enjoyed unusually writing up my PhD thesis, and so I figured, this is what I should do more of. And I gradually stepped down at Nature and went part-time as I wanted to do more writing, both science journalism, science communication, and writing books. And I spend my time now as a complete freelance, about 50-50 between the two. And frankly, it's the journalism that subsidizes the books. You don't get rich, you don't get any, next to no money writing books. You do it for other reasons, and I absolutely do. So that's what I do these days, and I've found that several of them have been increasingly about the life sciences, and in fact, the one I'm working on is very squarely that. And Janet, actually, I was at Harvard Medical School myself for 3 months in 2019. I spent the summer as a visitor in the Department of Systems Biology, and that was really, really useful and also vital input for the book I'm working on at the moment. So yeah, great place to be. So I guess that's me really. That's, these days I consider myself a science communicator in various ways. I do some science broadcasting and make programs for the BBC radio, but primarily it's writing about science, whether that's in national newspapers or in more sort of science-oriented forums like New Scientist and Quantum Magazine, or sometimes in the more technical literature for places. I write a column for Nature Materials. I write quite regularly still for Nature itself. So it's a whole range of audiences as well as topics.
Great, thank you very much to all three of you for the introductions to who you are and your perspectives. So what I would love to hear about, and I'm sure everyone else here in the call as well, is your advice to us as biological physicists of what we should be doing, what we could be doing better to communicate to others, and you can take the others as you wish, about what it is that we do. Things we aren't doing well, or if there's positive things you can certainly mention them too. And so I think what we'll do is we'll go in the reverse order. So Phil, if you'd like to start us off with that, and then we'll hear from each of the panelists, and after that we'll go to open forum questions. So be thinking while you listen to these questions for these experts.
Okay, thanks. So let me try sharing my screen. Hopefully hopefully that's working. Looks good to me. Yeah, I guess it felt like this is actually quite an opportune time to be talking about the public communication of biological physics, because I suspect, you'll probably be aware that last week work on the roles of liquid-liquid phase separation in cells, which I think is a classic example of biophysics, by Tony Hyman and Cliff Brangwyn, won part of the $3 million Breakthrough Prize for Life Sciences. And in fact, another part of the prize went for the team at DeepMind who developed AlphaFold, the machine learning algorithm for predicting protein structure from sequence, which is arguably another aspect of biophysics. So, you know, you might wonder, does this mean finally the field is getting some recognition, at least in this sphere? Well, I got an interesting sort of perspective on that when I talked about the work. AlphaFold had actually just got recently a lot of publicity when it had released its structure predictions for all known proteins just a few weeks earlier. And what was striking to me, I wrote about this in the, let me see if I can move this on. There we go. I wrote about this in the, so there's their Breakthrough Prize. That was the citation to Tony and Cliff and others. And I wrote about it in a popular affair, a current affairs magazine in the UK. And I'd been struck by how the media reports of this had made a big deal about how this was going to revolutionize drug discovery. So, you know, the idea being that if you can predict the structure, then you can predict which molecule is going to bind to a particular drug target. And I was pretty sure, and it was confirmed when I spoke to people who actually work in drug discovery, that it wasn't going to be such a big deal at all. It's going to be incremental, not least because actually identifying a candidate drug substrate, a candidate protein to hit, isn't the rate limiting step in drug discovery. So I wrote this piece that kind of made that apparent. And but I found that actually even my fellow science reporters were a bit bemused by this. They figured that, you know, this was a huge deal because I think they had assimilated what seems to me the kind of 1990s view that protein folding is, you know, that's the big problem in the life sciences. And if you crack it, everything else is going to spill out. And so they were sort of a bit puzzled by, you know, the fact that actually this wasn't going to be such a big deal for that particular aspect. It's fantastic work in its own right. And as for writing about liquid condensates in cells, well, I discovered that a lot of my colleagues had never even heard of this as a, you know, something that was a thing at all. It was a bit like it is whenever the Nobel Prize in Physics goes to someone in condensed matter, that you sort of feel all the, you know, newspaper reporters are scratching their heads to figure out how on earth they're going to convey what this is all about. I think it was a similar case here. And I felt that episode actually only reinforced how invisible biophysics tends to be in the sort of, not just in public perception, but in science communication generally, and even amongst my fellow science communicators. Why is that? Well, I've got various thoughts about this, but it's certainly the case that biophysics is a hard sell. It tends to demand a deep dive into the messiness of biomolecules, of molecular and cell biology. You know, you get these molecules with complicated names. It's not clear what the discoveries here have for things, what implications they have for things that the general public cares about, things like health and medicine. But I think it's also a hard subject to sell because I think it lies outside the prevailing paradigm of the life sciences today, in which, to the extent that thinks about mechanisms at all, they're sort of presented as a, you know, in these sorts, I mean, this isn't something that the public will see, but it reflects the perception. It's a dialogue of molecules, all kind of buzzing around and doing their things, but passing information one to the other in these kind of chains of interaction. And ultimately, all the public tends to get to see of all of this is a picture like this. Nancy said, if you've got any things to kind of advertise as you're talking, then you can do it. And this is actually a picture from the book that I'm just finishing off at the moment, which is really a book about what's in this black box, what this complex stuff is. But, you know, this is what we never see. It's just you go from genes to behavior or to organisms. And that's kind of summed up, I think, in the, this is another icon of our times. It's the kind of plot, it's called a Manhattan plot for obvious reasons, I think, that emerges from genome-wide association studies of traits, where basically the idea is you're just looking for gene variants that are associated with traits in a statistical survey of lots of different genomes. And you're not worried about mechanism, you just want to know the genes that seem to be linked, whether or not they're actually having a causal role. So there's not a lot of room in here for physics, it seems. My view is that, in fact, there's physics at the core of what's going on in this black box, and the role of condensates in cell biology is an example of that. They play a crucial role, it seems, in one way or another, in gene regulation and in many other important cell processes. And I think that's one way in which the view in what some are now calling the post-genomic era is changing. But I want to suggest to you that one of the obstacles in communicating biological physics and biophysics to a wider audience is actually an educational one, which means that removing that obstacle is going to be a long game. Put simply, a recognition of the many roles that physical processes play in life, I think requires that the life sciences begin to update their narratives, to bring them up to the current day, really, to make them fit for purpose in the 21st century. That's going to be quite a challenge. I mean, that's actually what my book is about. But that said, I want to just offer a few brief bits of advice that apply more generally to science communication. So I hope these will be a few tips if you're trying to, for example, interest a publication, your newspaper, the New York Times, Science, whatever, in your work. Find the right story, and by that I mean that what will work for a writer, for a journalist, may not be just a simplified version of the story that you tell in the paper. The challenge for people like us who are writing about it, and then by extension, the challenge for you, is to find a hook that is meaningful to a wide audience, while of course not overhyping it. There's no shame in claiming possible health or medical implications, so long as you make it clear, as is often of course the case, that they remain a distant project. Or maybe there's a long-standing puzzle that your work has finally resolved, or maybe there's been a popular conception about the way things happen that you've now falsified. Those are good stories, those are easier stories to tell. Don't be afraid to include the human aspects of what you've done. And in particular, reporters, there's nothing reporters love more than a good quote. Sometimes that'll make all the difference between whether they'll run a story and whether they won't. If there's a story behind why you chose to work on this project, or if it's something that you've been trying to crack for years, then say so. I remember many years ago, I was doing an interview for BBC Radio of someone a young researcher who'd harnessed biomolecular motors for nanotechnology. It was beautiful work, but he was dutifully explaining it, but somehow the account was just kind of flat. And then it just occurred to me to ask him, how did you feel when you came into the lab that morning and saw that your experiment had worked? And suddenly the whole tone of the conversation lifted and I got the material that I needed. You probably don't need that jargon. I know you think you do, but you probably don't. The way, the common thought is, how else will my peers know what this work is about if I don't use the right terms, if I don't use the names of these molecules and so on? But your peers, in the context of this broader task of communication, your peers are not your audience. So, really trying to put that aside. Find good metaphors. Metaphors aren't just handy tools for communicating complicated science. They are actually how we do science. In fact, they're how thinking works. Pretty much all thinking is metaphorical and analogy in some degree or another. What is transcription and translation and cell signaling and motor proteins and gene silencing and all the rest, if not metaphors? That's what they are. So it's worth looking for the right one. And if you find that the one you're trying to use is becoming too baroque or too oblique, then probably think again, look for another one, a better one. know who you're pitching to, and by that I partly mean find out the right editor to speak to, the one who's likely to be, or the right writer, the one who's likely to be interested in this. Understand the target audience. The target audience of the New York Times is different from that of New Scientist, and is different from that of a more specialized journal, probably different from Scientific American. But this isn't just a case of knowing your audience when you're communicating to the public. It's true of any communication. If you heed that maxim, if you think about your audience, then your talks and your papers, even at an academic level, will be better too. Remember that most readers and most reporters know next to nothing about what you're describing. And everyone assumes, in talks and in papers and everywhere, everyone assumes that everyone actually knows more than they do. But don't mistake that, you could say, ignorance for stupidity. This is the central thing for communicating science. The classic error in communicating is to overestimate what the reader knows and to underestimate the reader's intelligence. So those are my tips. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
That's great. So thank you very much. Those are excellent words of advice. Raghu, advice from your perspective too.
Yeah, that was really fantastic. Especially at the beginning, you Philip, really well pointed out this issue that biophysics is not in the popular consciousness, and I think one of the big challenges, as you've said and as we mentioned, for biophysics is just this lack of awareness that it exists, that it is an actual thing. And I also completely agree that the fundamental issue underlying this is one of education. And it's, extremely easy and in fact common to go through, secondary school, high school, and just never encounter the notion that physics provides a means for investigating the living world, or that biology is profoundly influenced by the physical properties of its components, and those physical interactions are in fact how components come together to give you, complex functional systems. And just as an illustration of that, my older son is in high school, and they were covering DNA and biology class, and I asked him, kind of at the end of this module, was it ever pointed out that like DNA is strongly negatively charged, or is charged at all? And the answer isn't surprising, although it should be surprising. The answer was no, this never came up at all. Despite it being, just a very fundamental physical property and just profoundly important to like everything DNA does, from how it wraps around histones and packaging to how we put it through gels for, all kinds of analytic tools. And just, that's not even mentioned in passing in standard biology education is really striking. So, so there is, I think, this profound lack of awareness that biophysics exists. And it is, I don't have a great answer for what to do about that, but I do think it should be kind of in our minds. And there are opportunities, I think, that come up from time to time to do something about that. As an example, and especially if people out there are at like universities like this one, I gave a talk a few weeks ago. We have a series of like meet the faculty sort of talks for incoming students. Regardless of like major, so you're just like talking to a wide swath of 200 random undergraduates, and sort of what do you find interesting? And I decided my theme for that is going to be biophysics exists, and hopefully conveying to people that now you're at a university, people study all kinds of things that you may not have ever heard of, whether it's computational linguistics or biophysics or whatever. Of course, my examples are primarily biophysical, but people can be made aware of the existence of these fields, and so it might be worth keeping an eye out, or even volunteering for opportunities to talk to the young impressionable people and try to get at that. The other thing that I've been thinking about kind of increasingly over the last several years is, okay, there's lots of things people haven't heard of. What's the cell for biophysics? SELL, not CELL. What's the hook? And speaking personally, and probably for you all as well, just the fact that it helps us make sense of the beauty, or appreciate the beauty of the living world, that's enough. And that's certainly the case for me. But especially from teaching a lot of classes for non-science majors and so on, I'm more amenable to that argument than the random person on the street. People want to know what's practically relevant, what's kind of important to their lives. And what I've found actually, this isn't surprising, but making connections to like health and disease is just a really, really good hook for getting people excited. And I do think biophysics could do sort of more of this. So, I mean, Philip was pointing out that it is often hard to make the case that this biophysical advance is going to lead to some benefits to curing some disease, and that's certainly true. But I mean, in a broader sense, the field has connections. Things we've learned that are kind of biophysical insights have helped us deal with all kinds of actual like medical issues. So a beautiful example, and one that I start off a like high school outreach activity I do is infant respiratory distress syndrome. So vast numbers of premature infants died all throughout history, and it's extending into the 60s and 70s, including one of President John F. Kennedy's kids died at the age of 2 days from infant respiratory distress syndrome, which is a disease in which the premature infant lung is not able to breathe. And the reason it turns out that it's not able to breathe is a lack of lung surfactants. So your body synthesizes a surfactant, just a soap, to lower the surface tension of your lung surface. And lacking that surfactant, the surface tension is too high. It takes too much just actual physical mechanical work to breathe, and tragically you die. And the cure for that is not some complex biochemistry or anything like that. It's basically putting soap into the lungs, so altering the physical properties here. And tens or hundreds of thousands of premature infant lives were saved by that insight. So I think there are a lot of examples like this where the field as a whole does actually have connections to disease, and I think it would help us to be more active in kind of pushing these. As one last thing that actually really struck me when I was writing the book, because I really, especially when planning it, just really kept kind of grilling myself, like, why on earth would, like, if I imagine saying something, then really asking myself, well, so what? Who cares? Just going through that iterative cycle over and over again. I started to think more about connections between biophysics and other things. And what really kind of struck me is that we live in this amazing age where you can sequence entire genomes for a few $100 and do all these kind of amazing biotechnological things that will continue to develop in just absolutely stunning ways. All of these, once you look at like how they actually work, how we're amplifying DNA or attaching it to beads to separate one thing from another, really make use of the physical properties of these molecules like DNA and proteins and so on. And I feel like the field as a whole doesn't really make that connection enough. Making high throughput DNA sequencing or RNA sequencing or all of these kind of beautiful things wouldn't really have been possible without the kind of thinking physically about the constituents of life. So I think that connection is one that we can stress more, and it would help out the field as a whole. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Raghu. And Janet.
Yeah, I guess in terms of what we can do better, so I have a pretty biased view in that, I do a lot of visualization. And so I do think, as scientists, we can do a better job at visual communication. And, so I got into animation, as I mentioned, because I was interested in synthesizing data. So dynamic data, molecular structures, things like that into kind of a visual hypothesis. And that's why I got into animation. And, and I've developed lots of animations over the years, and I've given a number of kind of presentations to the public where I am taking like a very kind of, very detailed molecular animation of some cellular process. And I've noticed some interesting things that make me think that, yeah, these kind of visualizations, if we could do a good job, not only helps our fellow scientists, but can really help kind of our relationship with the public. So just like a quick anecdote of like, so, having a public talk with kids and, non-scientists and talking about some specific molecular process. And I usually start out by showing the typical like textbook illustration of this process, which is like a bunch of circles and squares and lines. And, you're like, this process is super important. It takes, thousands of times a second in every single one of your cells, totally essential for life. And, they're looking at this figure, which is a bunch of circles and squares and lines, and, their eyes are still kind of glazing over. And then, you know, and you can, I think there's also a language difficulty, right? So you can start introducing protein names, and that's a lot of jargon to get through. But then when you show, you know, the animation that has a lot of the molecular detail, shows the crowding, the dynamics, a lot more complexity. I think, you know, what I've noticed is that I think people really perk up. And I think it humanizes the science in a way that's important to do. Like, so I think as a child or a non-science, anyone who's not in the sciences, I think if you can imagine, if I tell someone, here's a process, you know, circles, squares, lines, and there are scientists who spend their entire lives trying to figure out this process, and all they're looking at is circles, squares, and lines, they, I think, end up thinking like, wow, scientists are really weird. Like, why would anyone spend their entire life thinking about this? But then you show an animation that shows really what scientists are thinking, the movie playing inside the scientist's head. And I think it really humanizes it. People can be like, oh, this is really interesting and complex. And I can understand why somebody might spend their careers thinking about this really complex, difficult, you know, kind of dynamic process. And I've also found that people can ask questions, like really good questions, if you just make the science a little bit more intuitive and approachable. So I think, you know, that's kind of the hope that I you know, the vision of what visualization could hopefully bring to some aspects of, you know, the biophysics, molecular biosciences. Yeah, so that's, I'm hoping to kind of push the, you know, that we could definitely do a better job training our, you know, our graduate students, our postdocs to be kind of better visual communicators of their science.
Great, thank you very much for that perspective, Janet. So at this point, we will transition to a more open forum, Q&A. So questions could be asked by unmuting yourselves, and if you wish, turning on your video so we could see you, if you feel comfortable doing so. If you are unable to do that, you can put the question in the chat and I'll ask it. Sarah.
Hi everybody. I was just wondering how you get started in this kind of thing, because I know that there are probably a lot of people who are like, oh, this is so cool, but don't know how to go about, you know, really getting people to actually read what you write. So if you could just answer that, that would be fantastic.
Shall I kick off with a response to that? I mean,
Yeah.
It would partly depend on what you mean by this kind of thing, Sarah. Whether it's you know, whether it's writing books or whether it's you know, communicating. I mean, you know, there are so many degrees of it. I feel that there are some common threads that apply both to, you know, giving a talk at a conference and writing a newspaper article, but there are some things that are obviously extremely different about them. I mean, I got into it at a time when science communication, science writing, science journalism was not at all professionalized. I mean, this was the end of the 80s when I joined Nature. And these days, people who are editors who are coming to science journals and might then go on to work for a science magazine and you know, be a writer, tend to have very often a qualification in science communication. And there are plenty of places that, I mean, I don't know the ones in the States, but but in the UK, there are plenty of those that now exist. And so that's fantastic. Everything that I learned, I had to learn on the job and, you know, learn the hard way by making mistakes. And it was kind of fun and exciting, but I wouldn't get away with it these days. So, you know, if that's what you mean, if you're interested in science communication, science writing, science journalism, then I would certainly recommend looking at the places that run science communication courses. I mean, actually, I do know that Carl Zimmer does a very good one, but I guess that's based in Yale because I've participated in it. But you know, there are many. So, but I think also there's nothing to stop people from freelance pitching. If you think you want to give it a go and you have an idea, most science journals, most science magazines are open to that. And I think possibly even places like Nature might be open, or the Nature spin-off journals, of which there are more than I can keep track of these days. They might be open to that. They're always looking for, they have the sort of news and views sections. Writing for the news and views section of Nature was part of my training for writing, actually, for writing at that sort of intermediate level. So not for the general public, but for a broad range of scientists. So there are possibilities there, and it's always worth giving it a shot. Hopefully editors will always be willing to consider a pitch by someone they haven't come across before, particularly if you've got a good story and it's something, and in an area like this, it may well be something that they haven't already covered or are not already familiar with, and that could be a bonus.
Should I jump in?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. That's a great question, and I thought I'd add just a little bit of my own experiences. And the two things I would suggest are, one is look around for like kind of outreach or other activities wherever you are, and that's always sort of good practice for things. Even if they don't particularly involve writing, you may end up writing up something about them, and it's just very good practice of how do you communicate with different sorts of audiences and so on. So that's always good to look into. Also for myself, I found it actually very rewarding to maintain a blog. And even though I don't write as much as I would like, just from a lack of time, I've sort of managed to do a bit over one post a month. And just the routine of that has been good. And I would encourage you, don't really worry about whether anybody will read it or not, both because that's very hard to control, and because just the activity of writing, hopefully you'll either enjoy or find out whether you enjoy it, or find out whether you enjoy it or not. And the other thing is, one thing I've been kind of pleasantly surprised by is having something like a blog that's sort of out there and is sort of searchable. You do actually run into people who say, oh, I happen to have found your blog post on this or that. And it's actually really led to a lot of very good conversations with people. Plus, I mean, one of the unfortunate things about our age is that there's so much out there. But on the flip side, there's also so much out there that is kind of searchable. And I look up the statistics of my blog and things like that, and I find, for some reason, last month, 100 people read this thing I wrote in 2017 about something or other, and you kind of feel like there is some long-term impact of what you write. And also all of these, there is kind of a cumulative effect to all of these things. Currently, my blog, which isn't even terribly popular or anything, it does get close to 10,000 visitors a year, which is, at least for me, I find that very nice. And it didn't start out that way, but it's been the sort of steady accumulation. So whatever you do, if you start it now, eventually it may just steadily keep growing, and that's kind of a very satisfying feeling as well. So don't be discouraged if you sort of start out and you feel like it's just you talking into the void. Talking into the void is good practice, and it can build up to things more than you might think.
Janet, do you have anything you'd like to add to this question, or we move on to another? Okay, excellent. Okay. Oh yeah, Sarthak, go ahead.
Sorry, I have two questions. So first thing, so I'm a PhD student, and I also developed the outreach activities and stuff last 1 year to go to high schools and talk about biophysics. So 2 lessons, like we do diffusion and viscoelastic. Each of them have one demo, one group activity. Teachers like it, students also like it. But what I found, we went to several schools, several classes, about 20 classes or so. One thing I found in last 1 year is that, yes, we start question of say viscoelasticity. This is viscoelastic, this is what it is. The example of viscoelasticity, whereby we can use in real life, and we have questions and blah, blah. But at the end of it, students still, it's not part of standard syllabus in US. So students still are not very, very interested, or it's not what we'll do about it, kind of okay, I know this thing, I learned this thing, now what? So I struggled with that a little bit. I'm like, okay, now what you can do with this information. So how can I tell them where to apply, like biophysics topics or like these things. So this is the first one. And second question was like, so animation and stuff, where does one start? I am very interested learning in those things, but I always find like I know a little bit of Inkscape, but that's about it. But I want to learn more, but I don't know where to go for that, because I search for Google and there are like hundreds of options and I'm like, okay, then let's see tomorrow. So yeah, those two questions I had.
Well, I can answer the first one, but not the second one. The second one, but not the first one. So I'm not actually a biophysicist. So I can, but the second one, yeah. So animation is really easy to learn online. I mean, the way I would probably do it is just to take a course, that's just structured. And, so any software, if you're at a university, you can pretty much download, software for free. There's Blender, it's open source, free. I use Maya, it's by Autodesk, but you can get it for free, totally full version as an academic. And then, like I would just take an online class, so there's like LinkedIn Learning has a bunch of tutorials on like essential Maya, that kind of thing. And I would just go through it and just do everything. So the important thing is just not to just watch the tutorials, but actually to do everything that they're showing in the tutorials. So, when I learned animation, it was not scientific animation. Like I learned how to make explosions and like aliens and stuff, because that's the kind of courses that were available to me. And so that's what I did. And then it's just a matter of application towards your particular subject matter. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Great. Any comments on the first question about how to pitch, which was, I think, something, how do we get to figuring out what it is we ought to pitch?
Oh, well, I mean, I understood it to mean, and I have some thoughts about this. I understood it to mean, it's that so what question, so it's all very well giving information. You can tell them about this and that, and you could even tell them that DNA is negatively charged, and what do you do with that? What are students going to do with it? And to my mind, what I think it comes down to is to make it clear in learning about this stuff that we don't understand how life works. I think the common perception is we're telling you this is a little bit of how life works. This is another little bit. This molecule does something. And the implication is we know how it all fits together. We're just giving you bits of the puzzle. But actually, we don't. That is the biggest mystery in the middle, at the center of it all. We don't understand ourselves. We don't understand how we work. We know loads about it. We know loads of aspects of that. But there is, I'm quite sure there is no theory, there is no overarching view of how life works. And that to me is the most fascinating thing, that's what we're digging away at, but at the same time we're building up an edifice. And if we can show them, if we can show somehow what the broad framework for understanding that is, then we can see that actually this is what we're working towards, a true understanding of how life works, which then leads to an understanding of how to intervene in life, for example, when it goes wrong. Because we don't understand that either. Most drugs fail. Most medicines don't work. It takes ages to find anyone that does. That's because our understanding isn't good enough. We don't understand where to intervene, at what level to intervene. So these are really, really big questions. And I think one of the biggest questions in all of that is the thing that we lose very often in dissecting life into its molecules and its mechanisms is the question of agency. That, to me, is one of the fundamental questions about the life sciences. I mean, there isn't a consensus view of what that even means, but I think we have a sense that all living things possess this thing called agency, of some sort that makes them, in some ways, distinct from a lump of rock. What is that? So, I think maybe that's the place to start from, not giving the impression that it's all sorted out and we're just going to give you the little bits of knowledge that, are related to that. Actually, the biggest questions are ones that we don't have answers to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I'll just also add in, I think the challenge you're describing is it's a very difficult one. And really this question of like conveying to students, especially like high school students or even worse, like middle school students, why should I care? That is by far the hardest thing about designing any kind of educational or outreach activity. The rest is easy, like, but why should I care? And I just to, I'm kind of repeating myself, but I do think linking things like viscoelasticity, which are very abstract. I mean, even your sort of average physics or chemistry or material science, even undergraduate doesn't really kind of appreciate or understand this for a while. So it's a very kind of subtle thing. You know, what can grab somebody about viscoelasticity? We could start out pointing out, you know, your tears are viscoelastic. And what does that mean? And if you wanted to make a better eye drop, why is it, you know, why won't it work just to put water on your eyes? And, you know, things that, you know, everybody's cried. They're familiar with this liquid, and we get at the thing, you know, actually these things that your body makes have sort of interesting properties, and understanding them might be good for something. So I feel like a lot of these we can link back to the student's own sort of bodies or health or so on, which, you know, it sounds like that I actually kind of started out with the feeling, oh, this shouldn't be, you know, that necessary, but it really is. That kind of visceral, you know, human body kind of connection just works so well for so many people. It's almost hard to really appreciate until you see that approach working well. Because we, all of us in this audience, are not the typical like high school student. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So then we have a question from the chat, and I'll just read it, and then you can let me know who wants to answer. So do you think there's a reasonable way for the average academic researcher to really communicate their science well without it becoming a significant component of their work? It is appealing to the person asking this question, but most examples of people I see who are doing it well seem to have shifted their focus to it and away from their original research. And so we have two academics here who are doing research and communicating. So this is a great question for them. Raghu, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, it's a great question. Short answer is definitely yes. I think it's possible to communicate your science without it becoming a major component of your work. And I would just encourage you to just keep in mind there's a wide range of levels of things you can do, ranging from just, you know, writing up kind of lay reader summaries of your lab's recent papers and, you know, putting them on a blog, which is fun and which doesn't take that much work, all the way to having it be your full-time thing. I mean, yeah, so there's a range, and you can sort of situate yourself wherever on it you like. And you know, it, as you wrote in here, you know, most examples maybe of people who've shifted their main focus to be this, but of course, the people whose main focus is this, you hear more from them because it is their main focus. You know, I am a huge fan of Philip Ball's books, and there's no way on earth I could write that many books. Well, there's no way, period, I could, but there's certainly no way that I could and maintain my current job, but that's okay with me. So just find wherever on that continuum you would like to be.
I have some thoughts about this, and the main one is that this is something of a bugbear of mine. You know, it's a great question, and the way it's been asked is, you know, is there a reasonable way to communicate their science well without it becoming a significant component of their work? How on earth is it that we have this system where communicating your science well is not already seen as such an important part of your work? That should be essential for everyone doing science. It should be part of scientific training, how to communicate well. It doesn't mean that it has to take up a huge amount of the time, but it needn't do, you know, just being trained to do it well. And I think one of the problems with people who do this in academia in the past has been that it hasn't been recognized within academia, how vital, how important, and how much skill is required to do this well. That's starting to change. I know people in the UK who, you know, are researchers who make this an important part of what they do and are now at last getting recognition, but it's taken them a long time. And for a long time, they were, you know, they were discouraged actually from doing that kind of outreach work and that communication work, because it was seen to be taking away from their primary focus of doing research. Whereas I really think we need a change in culture that recognizes the vital importance of doing communication well.
Excellent. I can say from my own personal standpoint, I'm still very much on the learning stages of how to communicate, but I find like everything that I do, be it outreach or talks to high school students or whatever, it all helps me do a better job of pitching my science also to scientists and to framing introductions of my papers and to grant proposals, because the more I dig into it, and it takes a lot of iterative work, like just as I think Raghu was saying, you just keep pushing, well, who should care? Why should they care about that? Why should they care about that? And I think it can help us to get better at understanding why it is we're doing what we're doing and convince taxpayers or funding agencies and publishers that it's important to.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting it's, you know, being more recognized on the funding side. I mean, so NSF has always had the broader impact section required for all of their grants. It's expected that you put funding towards it. And it's usually expected that this be some sort of communication activity, whether it's teaching or, you know, so I think, you know, at least by NSF, this is recognized as something that scientists should be doing and that they will fund. And I think if that were kind of a requirement across the board, we would all probably be better science communicators for it.
Yeah. Okay, we are approaching the end of our hour. If anyone has another question, please state it. Otherwise, I have a question that I will ask. Okay.
Just very quickly. So you mentioned in the Philip, I think mentioned that like you need to find a hook and a right story when you are talking about your science. I was wondering, like, is there a strategy or like steps or like some kind of, you know, I don't know, recipe that one should follow, or is there anything like that out there?
I wish there was, Sartak, but I'm afraid if there is, I don't know it. All I really wanted to point out there is first of all, that you need to have that hook. It needs to be something you can write in a single sentence, you know, and that would be understandable, you know, to someone who isn't an expert, perhaps isn't even a scientist, and also that it may not be the one that you think it is. As I say, it may not be what you would, you know, put as the first line in your abstract or, you know, the conclusion of your abstract. You may have to take a different direction into the work in order to popularize it. So those are really the only tips I'd have for that.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so in the closing minutes, I know we're almost out of time, but if everyone can maybe just address this very briefly. I think one of the main ways in which many people, particularly the youth, are getting their information these days is through social media. And I'm wondering what your perspectives are on the importance of social media at communicating science, or more specifically, I guess, biological physics. Is that something that we should be making an effort to use, or we should just focus on other things? Love to hear your thoughts on that. So just unmute if you want to speak first. Wow, dead silence. Okay,
I'll go first. The only social media really that I'm on, I mean, I occasionally have a blog that these days I just use for saying things that I can't publish, or, you know, or that I don't have room to voice elsewhere. But the main social medium I use is Twitter, and it gets a terribly bad press, and for very good reasons. But if you use it carefully and judiciously, which I hope I do, and I just kind of use it professionally, actually I find it a fantastically valuable source for someone who does what I do and looking out for science news stories. It's a fantastic source for that, of what's going on. And it's a very good way of letting people know what I've done, both book-wise and in terms of articles, and that seems to work quite well. And I often get on the whole, thankfully, useful and constructive and helpful feedback. So I've found it a real bonus for what I do. I mean, at the same time, there is obviously the temptation that you just spend far too long on there and you get distracted from what you're meant to be doing. That's just part of life these days. But I do think it's a valuable resource, and I think that most institutions and research organizations, recognizing this. Obviously, the APS has various Twitter streams that it uses to good effect, and they're useful to me. So yeah, I see it professionally as a valuable tool.
Thanks. Raghu or Janet, either of you want to comment on this? Raghu?
I don't have much to say. I think maybe we should get Philip to do a Twitter tutorial at some point, because I feel like I do not use social media very well. I have a Twitter account, and I basically use it just to like post when I have a new blog post and encourage people to read it. There have been sort of blocked periods where I do kind of make an effort to engage more with Twitter, but I've done this a couple of times, and each time I end up finding it both time-consuming and depressing. So then I give up. So I don't have great advice or insight, but I do feel like it's something I should be better at, or should work more constructively towards.
Any thoughts on social media from you, Janet?
I mean, I find it useful, like if you make visualizations, you can post movies and stuff. And like, I guess what I've seen that's been pretty nice is people will take like our animations and they'll translate them into other, like we have an animation of SARS-CoV-2, the life cycle, and people have taken that animation, translated it into lots of languages, like made a whole Twitter stream, and it gets really out there. And so it's kind of a great way to get dissemination to audiences that I think you might not otherwise reach. So that's been, and it's kind of a direct line between scientists and the public, or can be. And so in that way, it can be very useful as a mode of dissemination.
Yeah, I would think with the visuals, particularly that.
Yeah, I think I've had a pretty good time with it. So yeah, I haven't had any, negative experiences really. And yeah, so I found it very useful for people to just get their science out there, especially if they have visuals, which I think really helps on Twitter. Yeah.
Great. All right, well, thank you all. And I ask the audience to join me in please thanking these amazing communicators for their advice and their time with us today. I've learned a lot, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much, and great to meet you all.